Racist cops arrest a black man, but freeze in shock upon discovering he is the police chief. The unexpected twist unveils the truth behind the injustice. The air was biting, crisp with the chill of a late winter evening. Christopher Blackwell's breath hung in the air like smoke, his chest rising and falling with the stress of the situation. The harsh, mechanical clang of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, sending a jolt through his body. His heart beat erratically, thrumming loudly in his ears as his mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. The cold metal of the cuffs dug into his skin, a cruel reminder of his powerlessness in this moment. The lights of the squad cars blazed against the night, the red and blue flashing in a relentless, rhythmic pulse. Each flicker seemed to cut through the dark like a blade, reminding him that he wasn't free. But the true sting wasn't in the cuffs or the lights. It wasn't in the cold, even though it gnawed at his bones. It was in the mocking laughter of the two officers standing over him, their sneers sharp in the night air. "Got another one," the taller of the two, Kyle Anderson, said with a cold grin. "Another thug to put away." Christopher's stomach churned at the word, the label they had so readily affixed to him. Thug. He had spent his entire life fighting that word, fighting the assumptions that came with it, fighting to prove his worth in a world that had already judged him by the color of his skin. Yet here he was, handcuffed, cornered, treated like every other man they'd decided wasn't worth their time. Christopher opened his mouth to speak, to argue, to demand an explanation, but the words felt heavy, like they were caught in his throat. His voice was hoarse with emotion. He had been through this so many times in his life, the stares, the whispers, the assumptions that he was something less. But this felt different. The weight of it wasn't just the typical police harassment. This was something colder, more personal. His eyes scanned the street, the familiar neighborhood he had called home for most of his life now feeling foreign. He recognized the blocks, the worn-down buildings, the corner store where he used to get a soda after school. But now, all he saw was judgment. All he felt was the weight of his past pulling him back, forcing him into a corner where he couldn't escape. "Let me go," Christopher said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. His fingers curled into fists, but they were useless with the cuffs digging into his skin. "I haven't done anything." Kyle ignored him, turning back to the squad car. "Yeah, you keep saying that. But we've got you on record, and we've got you on the ground. No one's listening to you now." Christopher's body stiffened, the cold growing deeper within him. On record. He thought of all the times the system had failed him, all the times he had been pushed aside, his efforts overlooked. The sting of rejection cut deeper now than it ever had before. He was a detective, a man who had worked his entire career to climb out of the hole they had placed him in. And now, he was once again a prisoner to their biases, their prejudice. "Where are you taking me?" Christopher's voice was barely a whisper, but there was no softness in his words. He needed to know where this was going. Kyle didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed Christopher by the arm and shoved him toward the back of the squad car, the harsh motion making Christopher stumble. His breath came faster now, a feeling of panic rising in his chest. The world around him seemed to spin, each detail sharp and sudden. The sound of tires rolling over asphalt. The acrid smell of exhaust. The glint of the police officer's belt buckle and the flashing lights. It wasn't just the physical situation that made his stomach twist. It was everything that came with it, the years of being dismissed, ignored, treated like he didn't matter. He thought of his mother, of how she had fought to keep him off the streets, how she had tried to make sure he had a future that wasn't defined by the color of his skin. She had taught him to rise above, to work harder, to prove his worth. And now, here he was, once again drowning in a world that wouldn't let him rise. As they shoved him into the back of the car, he heard Kyle laugh. "Another day, another one of you." The words hit Christopher like a slap. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but something in him held him back. His mind raced. He knew how this would play out. He would be taken to the station, processed, and left to rot. And no one would listen. Not unless he could somehow convince them of his innocence, but how could he when they had already made up their minds? The officer in the front seat turned and glanced back at him. A man named David Cooper. He was quiet, more reserved than Kyle, but Christopher could see the disdain in his eyes. The judgment. The knowing look that said Christopher was no different from the countless others who had passed through their hands, just another black man caught in the system. Christopher leaned his head back against the cold, hard window, closing his eyes. He could feel the weight of the night pressing in on him, each moment feeling heavier than the last. It was a familiar feeling, the weight of expectations and assumptions bearing down on him. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, something in him was breaking. He had fought for so long. He had tried to rise above the hate, to prove he was more than the world thought him to be. But now, in this moment, it felt as if everything he had worked for was being erased in an instant. As they neared the police station, Christopher's mind swirled with thoughts of everything he had lost. He thought of his career, of how he had worked his way through the ranks to become a detective, how he had fought tooth and nail to get here. And now, it felt like all of it had been for nothing. But just as the car pulled into the station parking lot, something unexpected happened. Christopher caught a glimpse of the officer's eyes in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he saw fear. Kyle's confident smirk faltered, his hand shaking slightly on the steering wheel. David Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Christopher furrowed his brow. The sudden change in their demeanor was palpable. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low, but steady. Kyle didn't answer right away. He swallowed hard, glancing at David. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. And then, for the first time, Christopher realized what was happening. Kyle, his face drained of color, glanced back at him in the mirror again, his voice faltering. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. David finally spoke, his voice trembling. We've got the wrong guy." Christopher's stomach twisted. "What?" Before he could respond, Kyle finally said it, his words heavy and reluctant. "You're Christopher Blackwell, the chief of police." The shock of it hit Christopher like a ton of bricks. The officers in the front froze. They had no idea who they had been arresting. "Now you're going to tell me why you're arresting me," Christopher said, his voice steady now. His mind raced, and a wave of power surged through him. These officers were the ones who had judged him, had humiliated him. And now, they were realizing just who they had crossed. The car came to an abrupt stop in front of the police station, the tires screeching slightly as if even the vehicle itself sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. Christopher Blackwell, still in handcuffs, leaned forward, eyes narrowed in disbelief. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the rush of emotions coursing through him. He had fought his entire life to get to this point, only to find himself here, caught in the hands of the very system he'd sworn to protect. He had risen through the ranks of the police force, working harder than most, overcoming every hurdle life had thrown his way. The prejudice he had faced in the academy. The disdain of his colleagues when he first donned the badge. But he had persevered, pushing forward because he believed in the change he could bring, the justice he could help administer. And now, these officers, these men who had been too quick to judge him, to label him a criminal, had no idea who he was. The weight of the realization hit him like a crushing blow. They had no idea they were arresting the chief of police. Christopher had deliberately kept his position a secret, not to manipulate or mislead, but because he knew what would happen if they knew who he was. He didn't want special treatment, but he sure as hell didn't want to be a target. In a world where systemic racism ran deep, where prejudice infected every level of authority, his skin color was both a weapon and a shield. It had been a long, arduous journey to get here, one filled with rejection and isolation. Christopher's mind drifted back to his childhood, those early years in the rough neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where violence and crime were an ever-present shadow. He had seen it all: drug dealers on every corner, broken homes, constant surveillance from the police, who saw nothing but criminals when they looked at black boys. He remembered how his friends had fallen into the trap of violence, how they had been swallowed by the system without even a chance to speak. Christopher had sworn that wouldn't be his fate. But it was never easy. Every step he took towards success was met with resistance, with the harsh reality of being black in a system designed to keep him down. His mother had worked tirelessly to keep him out of trouble, instilling values of perseverance and respect, but even she couldn't protect him from the weight of the world. As a young man, Christopher joined the police academy, determined to make a difference. The academy had been brutal, an environment where he was constantly reminded that he was an outsider, that he was different. He had been ridiculed by his fellow cadets, not only for his race but for his desire to be a force for good. They mocked him behind his back, whispered about his naivety, about how the system would break him, just like it had broken so many before him. But Christopher had pushed through. He had worked harder than anyone else, studying for hours after his training, sacrificing his social life, honing his skills. He had earned his position, his title, through grit and determination. Yet, the scars from those years never healed. He had fought tooth and nail to prove that he wasn't just another statistic, that he could break the cycle. But the truth was, the fight had never ended. Even as a detective, he had been doubted, disregarded by colleagues who saw his ambition as a threat. He had climbed the ranks, but with every promotion came more resistance, more whispers. The higher he rose, the more they tried to push him down. In some ways, he had always been alone. The police force had become his family, but it was a family that had never truly accepted him, never really believed in him. And now, here he was, dragged through the dirt by the very same system he had dedicated his life to. Christopher's mind snapped back to the present. He could see the two officers in the front seat, their hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Their faces, once hard with disdain, were now filled with uncertainty. They had no idea who they had just arrested, and the realization was sinking in. They could feel it in their bones. This wasn't just another black man they had caught in the streets. This wasn't some random criminal. This was the chief of police, and they had made a critical mistake. For a moment, the car was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the distant sound of voices inside the station. Christopher could feel the tension crackling in the air, the palpable shift in the officers' attitudes. Kyle Anderson, the one who had shoved him into the car earlier, now seemed unsure of himself. His shoulders were tense, and his usual cocky demeanor had evaporated into something resembling fear. What do we do?" Kyle muttered under his breath, clearly struggling to process the situation. David, the quieter of the two, spoke up, his voice shaky. We messed up. Big time." Christopher felt a dark sense of satisfaction rise within him, but it was fleeting. He didn't want their fear. He didn't want them to be scared. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was for them to recognize him as a man. Not a threat. Not a criminal. The officers didn't seem to know what to do. They had no experience in facing the consequences of their actions, especially not when their victim was someone they had once thought of as beneath them. Kyle finally turned around to look at Christopher, his expression hardening, but there was a flicker of doubt behind his eyes. "Look," Kyle started, clearly searching for some way out of this mess. "We didn't know who you were. But now we know. We messed up." Christopher's jaw tightened. "You didn't just mess up. You tried to break me." You tried to break me because of the color of my skin. Kyle looked down, guilt creeping across his face, but it wasn't enough. Christopher had endured too much to let a simple apology repair the years of hurt. This isn't over, Christopher said, his voice cold. You've crossed a line. And now, you'll pay the price. There was a brief silence before David spoke again. You're the chief of police? How is that even possible? Christopher met his gaze through the rearview mirror, his eyes piercing. It's possible because I fought for it. I fought for every step I took. I didn't get here because I was lucky. I didn't get here because I fit in. I got here because I fought harder than any of you ever will. The weight of his words hung in the air like an undeniable truth. It wasn't about power or revenge. It was about justice. And now, Christopher realized that he didn't need to prove anything to them. What mattered was that he had survived. What mattered was that he had risen above their hate. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The officers, still processing the bombshell they'd just been hit with, didn't say anything further. But Christopher didn't need them to. They could freeze. They could stutter and squirm. They could feel the burn of shame in their bellies. But nothing they did would change the fact that they had just crossed paths with someone who would never back down. And in that moment, Christopher knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or silenced by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Christopher sat still in the back of his squad car, handcuffed but not defeated, as the officers in the front seat struggled with the enormity of their mistake. The tension in the vehicle was thick enough to cut with a knife. The flashing lights outside seemed to echo the dissonance in the air, their bright colors pulsating through the night like a bad dream that refused to fade. Kyle and David were silent now, their faces pale as realization sunk in. The words Christopher had spoken to them, the sharp reminder of their hatred, their bias, their failure to see him as anything more than a black man on the street, had left a bitter taste in the air. They had been so sure of their actions, so certain in their assumptions. But now they knew the truth, and that truth felt like an anchor, dragging them into deeper waters. As the car finally rolled to a stop in front of the police station, the officers seemed to move in slow motion. The doors opened with a groan, but no one stepped out immediately. Christopher, despite being the one detained, could sense their hesitation, their reluctance to even breathe. The fear was palpable now, as though they were worried he might turn the tables and do something they wouldn't be able to control. Christopher's gaze locked with David's through the rearview mirror. The younger officer, who had been silent up until now, had a hollow look in his eyes. It was clear that the weight of what they had done was beginning to hit him, and Christopher felt no sympathy. Not this time. What happens now? Kyle finally spoke, his voice strained. There was a sense of panic in his tone, the kind that someone only gets when they know they've overstepped, when they know the consequences could be far worse than anything they had prepared for. Christopher kept his eyes forward, ignoring their uncertainty for a moment as he considered his response. He was still processing everything, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about an arrest gone wrong. This wasn't just about two racists having a misunderstanding. This was about the years of hatred, the judgment, and the structural violence that had fueled this entire incident. And Christopher had had enough. What happens now? Christopher repeated, his voice cold, calculating. You take me inside, and I'm booked just like any other suspect. I'm sure you two will be more than happy to see me behind bars. But when this is all over, you'll be the ones facing the music. Kyle swallowed hard but didn't respond. His eyes flickered toward David for some sign of support, but the younger officer said nothing. It was like they were both caught in an unfamiliar place, caught between the weight of their racism and the truth that had just shattered their perceptions. Christopher leaned back against the hard seat, feeling the sharpness of the metal cuffs digging into his wrists. But in that discomfort, he found clarity. He had spent his entire life fighting against the invisible chains of racism, against the perception that he was inferior. And here, now, in this car with two police officers who had tried to break him down, he realized something: they had already lost. The door to the squad car slammed open, and Kyle stepped out first, hesitating before offering Christopher a hand to help him out of the car. The gesture was laced with reluctance and a sort of awkward politeness, but Christopher didn't take it. He would stand on his own. Always. David, still in the front seat, slowly turned off the engine, his fingers trembling as he did so. He hadn't even realized it, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He knew that what they had done could end everything for them. A mistake like this? It was career suicide, especially when the man they had targeted was the very man they had sworn to protect. Christopher stepped out of the car, feeling the cold rush of the night air hit him. The police station loomed in front of him, an intimidating, gray building that held both his hopes and fears. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very institution he had spent his life serving, fighting to change from the inside, was now the place that would witness his struggle against those who had failed to understand him. As they entered the station, every step seemed like an eternity. Christopher's eyes flickered toward the officers, whose guilt was now as evident as their fear. He was acutely aware of the eyes that followed them from the desks in the hallway, officers who had worked with him, some who had respected him, some who hadn't. None of them knew what was happening, but Christopher could feel the silent judgment. The whispered rumors that would undoubtedly follow this incident. Inside the booking area, Kyle was the first to speak. His voice was small, almost apologetic. "We need to make this right. We had no idea who you were." Christopher looked at him, his expression unreadable. He wasn't interested in excuses. He wasn't interested in their remorse. "You didn't know who I was. But you judged me all the same. You assumed the worst. And you still would, if you had the chance." David, still in the front, swallowed. What do we do now? Do we call someone?" Christopher's eyes flicked to the front of the station where the sergeant sat at the desk, oblivious to the drama unfolding. The fact that they were all stumbling through this, fumbling in a situation that had suddenly turned beyond their control, gave Christopher a grim sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough to undo the hurt. The damage had already been done. "Call your supervisor," Christopher finally said. "Call whoever you need to. But I'm done talking. I've been talking to a wall my whole life. I won't keep fighting for those who can't see past their own biases." As he spoke, Christopher's eyes found the camera mounted in the corner of the room, the cold lens staring back at him. It was a stark reminder of everything he had worked for, everything he had built. He wasn't going to let this incident define him. Not now, not ever. David, still shaken, moved toward the phone. He dialed the number for his superior, his hand shaking as he spoke into the receiver. We need to report an incident. The suspect we brought in, we didn't know who he was." Christopher's ears perked up at the words. This wasn't just about them getting caught, this was about them trying to cover their tracks. They were preparing for the storm that was about to come their way. He let them fumble. He let them struggle. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. They would never forget the man they had tried to break. He wasn't just Christopher Blackwell, the chief of police. He was the man who had endured everything they had thrown his way and come out stronger. And they would have to live with the shame of their actions. But Christopher had something they didn't have. He had the truth on his side, and the truth had a way of cutting through all the lies. Christopher stood in the sterile, dimly lit booking room, the sounds of murmurs and footsteps from the station's inner corridors echoing like distant whispers in his mind. The chill of the cold cement floor seeped through his shoes, and despite his outward calm, he could feel the burn of anger and frustration roiling inside him. These officers had tried to break him, tried to lock him up, dismiss him, and erase him from the system they'd sworn to protect. But what they didn't know was that he was far stronger than they could ever have imagined. The bitter irony of it all hung heavily in the air. These were the very officers he had once worked beside, men who should have known better, who should have had his back, but instead saw a black man first and everything else second. It was always this way, wasn't it? The skin, the uniform, the badge, they all meant something different depending on who wore them. Kyle and David, still in shock, stood by the phone as the air between them became more suffocating. Christopher could hear David stammering into the receiver, trying to explain what had just transpired, but the words were coming out wrong. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The truth was undeniable now. Christopher couldn't help but smirk. He had known what would happen the moment he stepped into this station. The moment Kyle and David had dragged him here. They were drowning in the weight of their own choices, and Christopher would let them flounder. "I need to speak with your supervisor," Christopher said, his voice calm but laced with authority. David looked at him nervously before nodding, handing the receiver to Kyle. There was a crackle of static before a voice on the other end came through. "What's the situation?" "Sergeant, we've made a mistake," Kyle stammered, the realization of what he had done sinking in deeper. "The suspect we arrested, he's the chief of police. Christopher Blackwell. Sir, this is bad. We've really messed up." Christopher couldn't help but watch as the color drained from Kyle's face. He hadn't expected it to be so anticlimactic, but there was a certain satisfaction in seeing the officers who had wronged him try to cover their tracks. They had no idea what was coming for them. The system they thought they controlled had just shifted, and they would be left to deal with the fallout. The sergeant's voice on the phone grew tense, but Christopher couldn't make out the words. The station was starting to stir with new activity. He could feel eyes on him now. His very presence in the building had disrupted something deeper than just their professional obligations. Christopher had shaken the foundation of everything they thought they knew. "I think we need to bring him in, sir," David said hesitantly after a long pause. "We need to report this. We can't just let him go like nothing happened." "No," Christopher said firmly. "You won't report anything. You'll take responsibility for your actions. You'll be held accountable for every second I've been dragged through this hell." The words fell heavily between them, and the two officers shifted uncomfortably. The air grew colder, and for a moment, there was no sound but the sharp click of the clock on the wall ticking away. The silence stretched on, unbearable in its intensity. Kyle and David exchanged a look, but neither of them seemed to know what to do next. The situation had spiraled beyond their control. They had crossed a line, and there was no way back. Christopher knew this wasn't just about the power imbalance, this was about them facing the very consequences they had so willingly imposed on others. "I want you to understand something," Christopher continued, his voice gaining strength. "This isn't just about me. This is about every black man, every black woman, every person who's been wrongfully accused, humiliated, and incarcerated because of the color of their skin. Do you understand? This is about the system that failed us long before we even set foot in this station." Kyle's face twisted with discomfort as he shifted on his feet. We didn't mean for it to happen like this," he muttered, his eyes flicking to the floor. "Of course you didn't," Christopher replied, his tone icy. "You never mean for it to happen. But it does, over and over. It happens to people who look like me, to people who don't have the power to fight back. And you're no different than the ones who came before you, who tried to break me just like you tried tonight." David looked at Christopher, his eyes wide with remorse, but Christopher was beyond sympathy. He'd been hurt too many times to care for it now. Before he could speak again, the door to the booking room opened, and the sergeant walked in. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, and his heavy boots echoed on the tile floor. The man had been a fixture in the department for years, and Christopher had worked alongside him for most of his career. He had been one of the few to respect Christopher's drive, but now he stood before him, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. "What the hell is going on here?" The sergeant's voice was sharp and demanding. He glanced from Kyle to David, then to Christopher, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Kyle, David, you two know better than this. What's the situation?" Kyle looked back at David, and Christopher could see the hesitation in their eyes. The reality of their actions hit hard, but they still hadn't found a way to escape the consequences of their mistake. "Sergeant, this man we brought in?" David stammered, trying to maintain control of the situation. "He's Chief Blackwell. We didn't realize." The sergeant's face contorted in disbelief. He blinked a few times, as though trying to process the information. "What? Blackwell? You're telling me this is the chief of police? The chief of our department?" Christopher stood tall, facing the sergeant with cold, unwavering eyes. "Yes. I'm Christopher Blackwell. The chief of this department. And you are the ones who've been complicit in a system that's worked for years to break people like me." The sergeant stared at him for a long moment, his mouth slightly agape. It was clear that the realization was taking a moment to sink in. The weight of their actions, the consequences of their prejudice, were now laid bare. The sergeant's jaw tightened, his body language shifting as if he was trying to figure out how to react, but there was no escaping the gravity of what had happened. Christopher wasn't done. "No more pretending you didn't know," Christopher said, his voice biting. "It's too late for that. What happened here tonight doesn't just impact me. It's a message to everyone who's ever been treated like they didn't belong. Like they weren't good enough. Like they didn't matter. But I'm still here. And I'm not backing down." The sergeant's face hardened, but Christopher could tell he was already calculating his next move. There was a shift in the room, an unspoken recognition that the chain of command had just cracked, and everything was about to change. But Christopher had no time to wait. He had come too far to let it all be undone. The system would see the cost of its mistakes. And those who had wronged him would learn that the man they tried to silence would no longer be voiceless. Christopher Blackwell stood motionless, the quiet hum of the station pressing in on him. The tension in the room thickened as the sergeant processed what Christopher had just revealed. The weight of the officer's misunderstanding had shifted the entire atmosphere, their actions now laid bare under the harsh light of truth. The sergeant, still trying to process the shock of the situation, stared at Christopher as if he were a ghost. He had worked with Christopher before, seen him rise through the ranks, witnessed his unwavering dedication to the force. But that was before the badges and the uniforms had been stripped away. Before skin color had become the deciding factor. "Chief Blackwell," the sergeant finally said, his voice lower than usual, almost hesitant. I don't understand. How did this happen?" Christopher didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He was well beyond the point of explaining. The question, though well-intentioned, was empty. It didn't matter how it had happened. What mattered now was the reckoning, the moment when everything would unfold and the cost would be paid. The truth was both a weapon and a mirror, and Christopher had wielded it, putting the officers in front of him face to face with their own complicity. "What happens now?" Kyle's voice cut through the air, almost frantic in its uncertainty. He couldn't look Christopher in the eye, as if the guilt would choke him if he did. "What do we do, Chief?" Christopher took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands still bound by the cuffs. His chest tightened, but not from fear, this was something else. This was the pressure of knowing that the system had failed, and yet it was his responsibility to force change, no matter how painful or uncomfortable. Do? Christopher repeated, his voice laced with an eerie calmness. You do what you should have done from the start. You face the consequences of your actions. You take responsibility. But don't expect me to be the one to fix this for you. The words stung. The officers' faces twisted in disbelief and discomfort, unable to fully comprehend the enormity of what Christopher was implying. He wasn't interested in revenge. No, revenge was too easy. What he was demanding was accountability. The same accountability he had fought for in his own career, year after year. David stood frozen by the phone, his eyes wide, blinking rapidly as if he couldn't process the situation. But, Chief, he began, his voice wavering. We didn't know. I swear, we didn't know you were. Christopher cut him off with a sharp glance. It doesn't matter what you knew or didn't know. What matters is what you did. You targeted me. You saw me, a black man, and assumed I was just another suspect. You didn't care who I was. And now you have to face the consequences of that. The sergeant stepped forward, trying to gain control of the spiraling situation. Christopher, I'm going to make sure this gets handled properly. We'll start an internal investigation. Christopher's laugh, short and bitter, cut him off. Internal investigation? Is that really how we're going to play this? An investigation? That's what you think will fix this? The sergeant faltered, his expression a mixture of unease and regret. He had seen Christopher stand in front of meetings, commanding respect, exuding professionalism. But now the veneer had cracked. Christopher was no longer the respectful officer who had worked beside him for years. He was something else entirely, someone who was done being overlooked, done being the exception to the rule. I don't need an investigation, Christopher said, his voice low but firm. I need change. Real change. This isn't about me. It's about everyone else you've ever treated like this, people who don't have the luxury of a badge to protect them. This is about every black man and woman you've disregarded simply because they didn't fit your idea of what was acceptable. This is about all of it. And I'll make sure that you and everyone else who thought they could get away with it will be held accountable. The silence in the room was suffocating, the air thick with the realization that the weight of Christopher's words had struck them all like a lightning bolt. The officers were on the edge of something much bigger than they could comprehend, and Christopher was prepared to watch it unfold. You're right, Kyle muttered, his voice barely a whisper. His words trembled as if they were laced with defeat. We didn't think this through. We thought you were just another person to arrest, to lock up like everyone else. Christopher's jaw tightened as he stared at him. There was no sympathy left. The wounds had been too deep, and the damage too long-lasting. But his expression softened slightly, enough to let the words settle in. And now you have to deal with the consequences. But not just for me. For everyone you've ever done this to. You'll have to live with that. David, still staring at the phone, seemed to come to some sort of realization. He didn't meet Christopher's gaze, but his shoulders slumped slightly as if a weight was slowly crushing him. We never thought it could be this bad, he murmured. Christopher shook his head. That's the problem. You never think. You just act. You let your prejudices guide you, and then you wonder why everything falls apart. Chief, the sergeant interrupted, his voice tinged with frustration. This doesn't have to escalate. We can handle this internally. Let's keep this within the department, all right? We don't need the press involved. Christopher's eyes flashed with anger at the suggestion. Internally? You want to sweep it under the rug? You think that's going to make things better? How many times have you let things slide, thinking it was easier to ignore the truth? It's never been about the press, or the outside world. It's always been about what happens inside these walls. It's about the systems we uphold. And I'm done letting those systems hurt people like me." The sergeant's face paled, and for the first time, Christopher could see the fear creeping into his expression. He wasn't just worried about his career anymore. He was worried about the truth being exposed in ways he couldn't control. David, his hands now shaking, reached out for the phone. "I'll call the higher-ups," he said quietly. "We need to report this. We need to be transparent. We can't hide this." Christopher nodded once, the briefest of acknowledgments. "Good. You should. But don't think this ends here. It's just the beginning." As David dialed the number, Kyle stood frozen, his eyes vacant, as if the weight of what he had done was slowly eating him alive. Christopher wasn't concerned with their feelings anymore. He had moved beyond that. The only thing that mattered now was the truth, and the truth would prevail. But Christopher could feel something stirring in his chest, an unfamiliar pressure building. Something was changing. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about two officers who had gotten it wrong. It was about something much bigger. A door slammed open behind them, and Christopher turned. The air shifted as an unexpected voice echoed through the station. "Christopher Blackwell," the voice said with a mix of reverence and disbelief. "You're under arrest." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and Christopher's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the end of the story. This was only the beginning. Christopher's mind raced. The room seemed to freeze in time as the voice from behind cut through the tension like a blade. "You're under arrest," the voice repeated, but this time it wasn't directed at the officers. It was directed at him. Christopher turned slowly, the realization crashing into him like a wave. Standing in the doorway was none other than Detective Gregory Marks, an old colleague who had risen through the ranks just as quickly as Christopher had. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the scene in front of him, the two officers, frozen in place, the sergeant still fumbling with his words, and Christopher himself, standing handcuffed and resolute, a man who had been brought to the edge by his own colleagues. "Marks," Christopher said, his voice steady despite the swirling emotions in his chest. "What's going on here?" Gregory didn't respond right away. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the atmosphere. But Christopher could see it in his eyes. He wasn't here to help. "What do you mean, what's going on?" Gregory said coldly, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You've caused a scene, Blackwell. This isn't just about you anymore. You think you can break the system and walk away unscathed? No. There's no easy way out." The air in the room grew thicker. The weight of the words hung in the air, oppressive, as Christopher realized what was happening. The walls he had spent his entire career breaking down were being rebuilt now. He narrowed his eyes at Gregory. "You're not here to help," Christopher said, more of a statement than a question. "You're part of the problem, aren't you?" Gregory's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. "You think you're special, don't you? Just because you wore that badge? The truth is, you're no different from them. You've got the same ego, the same blind loyalty to a system that's never going to let you win. I'm sorry, Christopher, but this is bigger than you." He gestured to the officers behind him, who were still standing awkwardly, unsure how to respond to the escalating situation. Christopher's heart thudded in his chest, his anger swelling. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to stand down. "If this is bigger than me," Christopher said, his voice hard, "then why are you standing here, Gregory? Why did you let this happen? Why did you pretend not to know who I was when you've known me for years?" Gregory took a step forward, the shift in the room becoming palpable. "Because you were never really one of us, Christopher. You never belonged to the system. You were always an outsider, trying to change things from the inside. And they didn't like that. They didn't want someone like you in charge. Christopher clenched his fists. He had never felt more alone in his life. The people who had once stood beside him, believed in him, now saw him as the enemy. They saw him as a threat to everything they had built, everything they had relied on. They feared what he represented. The sergeant, still trying to regain control of the situation, stepped forward. "Gregory, this isn't the time for this," he said urgently. "Christopher's still our chief. We need to resolve this without escalating things further." But Gregory wasn't listening. His eyes never left Christopher, as if he were preparing for something bigger than just this moment. Christopher's pulse quickened as he realized what was happening. He had been playing a game with the system, trying to make them see the truth. But now, the game had shifted. He wasn't just up against corrupt officers anymore. He was facing a conspiracy, one that stretched deeper than he could have ever imagined. Gregory stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Christopher could hear. "You think this is about race? It's not. This is about power. You've never understood that, have you? You've been too busy trying to fix the system, and in the process, you've made enemies. You've made enemies of the very people who control it." Christopher's chest tightened as the implications of Gregory's words sank in. This wasn't just a case of racism. It was deeper, something far more dangerous. The system was not just broken, it was rigged against anyone who dared challenge it, no matter who they were. "Do you really think you're going to change things?" Gregory continued, his voice laced with mockery. "You're a pawn in a game that's been in motion long before you even stepped into the station." Christopher's mind raced. This was it, the ultimate betrayal. The people he had trusted, the people he had worked with for years, were all part of the same machine that had kept him in check. They had never seen him as a colleague, as an ally. They had always seen him as a threat. The room was suffocating now, the walls closing in on him. He felt the bitter sting of betrayal, of loss. But there was something else, too, something inside him that refused to back down. He had come too far to let them tear him apart now. The truth had always been his weapon, and he would use it one last time. Christopher took a deep breath and looked directly at Gregory. "You think this is over? You think you've won? This is just the beginning. You don't get to control the narrative anymore. I won't let you. I'll make sure this comes to light, every last part of it." Gregory's smirk faltered for a moment, but it returned quickly. He stepped back, giving a signal to the officers behind him. "Take him in," he said, his voice final. But Christopher didn't move. He wasn't going to let them take him without a fight, not physically, not mentally. He had made his choice, and he was willing to face the consequences. As the officers reached to move him, Christopher's voice rang out, loud and clear. "This isn't the end of my story. It's the beginning of something much bigger." The air was thick with uncertainty as they hesitated for a moment. Christopher could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the realization that they had underestimated him. But they were too far gone now. And as the officers prepared to escort him out, one final twist of fate occurred. From the back of the room, another voice, this one unfamiliar yet authoritative, spoke up. "Actually, we're going to need to release Chief Blackwell. He's not going anywhere." The officers froze, and Christopher turned, confused. A woman stepped forward, tall, confident, her uniform marked with the insignia of the state attorney's office. "I'm Special Agent Ava Carter," she said, her eyes fixed on Gregory and the others. "And I think we're going to have a few questions for you." The room fell into a deep silence as Agent Ava Carter stepped forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the station. The officers, who had been so sure of their actions moments before, now stood paralyzed, caught off guard by her sudden appearance. Gregory Marks, who had been reveling in his victory, now looked like a man who had been caught in his own trap. Christopher stood motionless, still handcuffed, but for the first time in hours, he allowed himself a breath of relief. He wasn't alone. There was someone who had been watching from the shadows, someone who had been tracking the corruption and injustice long before he had been dragged into this moment. "I'm Special Agent Ava Carter," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "And I'm here to ensure that the truth is exposed. The investigation you've tried to cover up? It's not over. In fact, it's just begun." Christopher felt a weight lift from his chest as he locked eyes with her. The doubt, the uncertainty, the feeling of being completely alone, all of it seemed to dissolve in that moment. Someone had come to fight the battle he had started, to bring the light into the darkness that had been festering for far too long. Gregory took a step forward, his smug expression faltering. "This is ridiculous. We don't need you here. This is an internal matter." Agent Carter raised an eyebrow. "Internal?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "The same internal matter that you've tried to bury under layers of secrecy? The one that's been running unchecked for years? I think it's time for you to understand that the people who thought they could control everything have lost their grip." Behind her, a few more agents stepped into the room, their presence like a storm ready to break. They moved quickly, taking positions around the officers, watching them carefully. It was clear that they had been waiting for this moment to come, waiting for the right time to expose the corruption that had spread through the police force like a cancer. Christopher's heart beat faster, but this time it was a feeling of anticipation rather than fear. He wasn't going down alone. And for the first time in years, he was seeing the system start to crack. He had fought to make a difference from the inside, but the truth had always been bigger than him. Gregory's face turned red as he opened his mouth to protest, but Agent Carter was already one step ahead. "We have plenty of evidence," she said calmly. "Evidence that points to your involvement, Gregory. You're not getting away with this. Not this time." Christopher could feel the anger rising within him as Gregory's face twisted in rage. The man had thought he could control the situation, but now he was exposed, his actions laid bare for all to see. Christopher had always believed in justice, but now he was seeing it play out in ways he never expected. "We have wiretaps, surveillance footage, and testimonies from people who were too afraid to speak before," Agent Carter continued. "But it all ends today. You're done." Christopher glanced at the officers behind him, the ones who had once been his colleagues. They were still frozen, unsure of what to do now. The fear in their eyes was palpable, fear of being caught in the crossfire of a scandal that had already begun to spiral out of their control. They had been complicit in the corruption, too blinded by their own biases to see the damage they were causing. But now, they were watching as the system began to turn on itself. Agent Carter turned back to Christopher, her expression softening just slightly. "I know this hasn't been easy," she said, her voice almost sympathetic. "But you did the right thing. You fought when everyone else turned a blind eye. You exposed the truth." Christopher nodded, the weight of everything he had gone through over the past hours finally beginning to settle in. It wasn't just about the betrayal of his colleagues or the racism he had endured. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. It was about being willing to risk everything for the greater good. As the agents moved to place the officers in cuffs, Christopher stepped forward, his posture now one of strength. "This isn't over," he said, his voice ringing out in the room. "This is just the beginning. You've all underestimated what happens when the truth comes to light. You've underestimated how far we'll go to make sure justice is served." The sergeant, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke. "We didn't know. We didn't know what we were doing." Christopher shook his head, his disappointment clear in his eyes. "That's always the excuse, isn't it? We didn't know." You all had a choice. You always had a choice. As the agents began leading the arrested officers out of the room, Christopher felt a sense of finality settle over him. The wheels of justice were turning, and the system that had failed him and so many others was finally being held accountable. But even as he stood there, a part of him knew that this victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much larger. The door swung open, and Christopher felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was free, truly free, for the first time in years. The world outside awaited him, full of unknowns, but for the first time, he had control over his own future. As the last officer was led away, Agent Carter turned to Christopher. "You're going to be okay," she said softly. "You've done what so many others were afraid to do. Now, it's time to rebuild." Christopher gave a small, weary smile. "It's just the beginning." And with that, the door to the station closed behind him.